Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
Hello everyone and welcome to Fast Talk. I'm your host, Chris Case. Today in episode 95, we talk in depth about the humble tire. Often neglected, frequently misunderstood, the lowly tire is a much more complicated piece of equipment than many people know. Today, with the help of two very talented technical gurus, Leonard Zinn and Legan, we explain the complexities of the tire pressure, and how those things lead to changes in comfort, grip, rolling resistance, and much, much more. So, get your silk tubulars ready, but whatever you do, don't pump them up to 180 psi. Let's make you fast. Well, it's always a pleasure to have you in the studio with us, Leonard. I like to call you a legend, and that's because you are a legend, and you know so much about so many things in the bicycling world. Today, I know this is going to be at times a little technical, at times hopefully a lot practical. It's something that you've, in a sense, researched for years, both in Finland, in the Microbac laboratory right down the street from us. So you have a wealth of knowledge on the art, Zinn in the art of tire pressure is what we're calling this episode. It's all about how pressure inside the tire affects everything from comfort to speed to ride quality. There's the physics of that. There's the practical nature of that. So we really want to dive into that topic. For those of us who ride cyclocross, I think the effects on ride quality and grip and all of these things are readily apparent based on tire pressure because we mess with it a lot. We run really low pressures. So people that are comfortable in that space, have done some cyclocross and have played with that, know a bit about what we're talking about. I think there's a lot of other people that don't do that or are sort of like 110 psi on my 23s, that's the way to go, sort of stuck in a rut or stuck in that mentality. So we want to break some myths today. We want to just open people's minds and hearts to the art of tire pressure.
Okay,
I love that you said stuck in the mindset of 110 psi. Leonard and I can both talk about the days when people were looking for tubulars that could pump up to 180 because 160 wasn't enough.
Right.
Well, there's that too, yes.
Yeah, I pretty much always used silk tubulars at 135 psi. I thought that was the thing for racing. I raced all kinds of big races with that, and God, when I think about how much harder I was working than I needed to now.
Seems like you are at effectively defeating the purpose of running a nice, supple tire.
I was, yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So you got all that silk there, and then you basically turned it into concrete.
yeah, that's right.
Knock your teeth out.
That's right.
Most people probably don't really think too much about tires. They think, oh, I put it on my wheel, I pump it up, and I ride. But they're actually a little bit more complicated than that. And there's a lot of variables involved. There's the construction, there's the width, there's the tread pattern, there's the construction affects a lot of things because it has to do with whether it's not only are we talking tubular versus tubeless versus tubed or clincher, but vulcanized versus non, et cetera. So just give us a sense of how actually complicated the tire is.
Well, yeah, the tire is pretty complicated. It's made up of many parts of the casing and whatever is constraining the air inside, whether it's an inner tube or if it's a tubeless tire, if it's just a thick coating of rubber on the inside of the casing, or that with tire sealant sloshing around in it. Then you have the tread itself and how it's attached to the tire and what the tread is made out of. They're engineers that spend their whole careers just mixing different things into latex or into a synthetic rubber compound to try and reduce the energy loss in it, reduce the
Tire
hysteresis
nerds.
of it. Yeah,
There are tire nerds in this world.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tread
Tread
compound
nerds.
nerds. Yeah. And that can be a big deal. The average person is not going to be sensitive enough to really be able to tell fine differences between rolling resistance of different tires. So it's kind of easy to I just pump my tires up and go, until, it's pretty obvious to you if you get on a mountain bike with, especially like a fat bike with like 4-inch tires on it, and you go riding down a smooth road, you're clear, you're working a lot harder rumbling along with that than when you're on a really nice tire on a road bike. And it's not, I'm talking also at low speed where it's not just an aerodynamic difference, but really just the rolling resistance. You can feel that when it gets finer and finer. I mean, roadies could be familiar with, their tires that are made to really completely be resistant to punctures. So they'll have a casing made out of an fully aramid casing, which basically means that the casing is made out of Kevlar instead of out of cotton or nylon or one of the other materials that's used to make the casing with. And Kevlar is just some really stiff stuff. You've got this Kevlar fibers, and maybe that benefits you if you're in a place where you've got horrible problem with thorns, and in the end you'd be faster because you're not stopping to fix your tire all the time. But really, the tires like that, holy smokes, most people that ride a lot can tell the difference between riding one of those tires, puncture-proof tires, and riding a nice tire, or a solid tire, for instance. That's another example of a tire that's really slow to roll.
Yeah, and all of these things that we're talking about, the construction, the width, the pressure, they go hand in hand with, and it's a balancing act between comfort, speed, durability, ride quality, all of those things. So that's why I say it's complicated. You could just, and a lot of people do, just get any old tire, put your gator skins on there that will never puncture, and they're fine with that. That's great. But there are tires that will make it's like an entirely different world when you get on a nice, supple tire and have it at the appropriate pressure and width and all of that, and it's like a glorious thing.
And it's much easier to keep up with your friends.
Right, well, there you go. Yes, you don't have to have an e-bike at that point to keep up with your friends. Just use better tires.
Okay, Leonard, I think it would be helpful for you to define some terms related to tire pressure.
I think one that's critical with talking about tires and tire performance is to discuss hysteresis. Anybody that's taken elementary physics has run into it, but it usually wasn't talking about rubber. It was talking about magnetism, and the oblong curve that is created by hysteresis, which has to do with basically a lag between the applied force and the resultant action. And in the case of rubber, it's because it's an elastic material. And when I say rubber, I'm referring to tread compounds. And I know companies want to talk about their proprietary tread compound and whatever, and it's not rubber or whatever, but basically it's rubber.
Okay, all right.
And when you apply a force to rubber, there's this delay because it's elastic. Once you pushed it far enough, then it starts moving. But then when you release the force, you don't get all the energy back. There's a delay in returning it. And so a hysteresis curve, instead of being like a line that goes out and comes straight back on the same line, it follows two different paths out and back.
Creating a loop.
And that loop, the wider that loop is the greater the energy loss in that cycle. And so when the tire is rolling along the ground, there's this lag between the tire reacting to the force of the ground is applying on it. And then there's
a bump or some
yeah,
divot in the surface.
Even just in asphalt, there's all the little particles in the asphalt that are all stuck together, and just in conforming to those, and then returning to its original shape. Each one of those back and forth, there's a little bit of energy loss. And obviously, if you're trying to propel a bike the most efficiently, then you're trying to minimize any energy losses you can, and that's one of them.
The root word here perhaps is hysteria. Does that help people envision what's going on inside a tire? Perhaps, I don't know. I don't even know if that's the correct root word, but to me it makes me think of hysteria or hysterical. Like there's a lot of confusing energy going on inside a tire if you continue to have it hit up against obstacles of one size or another. That's kind of how I envision this, because it's a technical physical process, but if you just think of sort of like hysteria, maybe it makes a little more sense to people. How does that relate to internal friction?
Well, sort of one and the same thing, hysteresis and internal friction. That's the frictional resistance of a tire rolling without slipping is all about. There's all these parts of a tire. You have the casing and the tread compound and if it's like a handmade tire would be glued to that casing, whereas a vulcanized tire, the whole thing is all molded together in one piece. But you'd have this interaction between all those things. There's hysteresis in the tread compound in the rubber tread, but there's also energy loss in the deflection and return of the tire casing. The threads are all either stuck together very tightly in a vulcanized tire, or they're more free to move independently. And if they're finer threads, then those are able to move with back and forth with less energy loss than ones that are big and thick. That it's not only more mass, but they're just stiffer. So to make them move, and then they're coated with rubber, so returning the whole elasticity, hysteresis loss is part of that. So that's the internal friction that we're talking about, really, is that hysteresis curve.
Yep. So I don't understand the science nearly as well as you, but the way it was explained to me that I kind of had an aha, I kind of get that, is there's a contact area with the ground. How much of the tire is actually touching the ground at any given point. And that contact area is actually remarkably consistent, whether you're using a 21, 23, 25C tire. So if you are using a narrower tire, there actually needs to be more deformation of the tire to get that same contact area with the ground. And every time you're deforming the tire like that, as you said, you lose a little energy after that part of the tire leaves the ground and tries to return to its original shape.
Think about if you were to zoom in on a tire that's pumped up really hard and it's going over a rough surface, then the tire is not deforming to meet that obstacle in such a way so that the bike is having to travel up and over each one of those things more so than if you're riding a tire that's wider or lower pressure and is able to absorb those things. And you're going to get to this term too, the
sprung weight versus
sprung weight.
unsprung
The
weight.
sprung weight isn't having to be lifted over each of those bumps with every time the wheel hits one of those small obstacles. Again, if we're zooming in on this tire as it hits the ground or a rock or a pebble or a divot or whatever the case may be, again, if it's really hard, it's traveling up and over every one of those little things more so than if it's just kind of smushing and absorbing all that stuff. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes, that's right. And I think an easy way to think of it is to think about it on a much bigger scale and to think about suspension. So on a mountain bike, I think everybody that's ridden a mountain bike a lot has a very clear sense of how if they're going to go down a steep, super rough trail and they're on a bike with a lot of suspension travel. First of all, it's a much smoother ride going down, and when they get to the bottom, their wrists and shoulders and arms and triceps aren't completely beat. They don't have that itchy feeling to their arms from having tried to control it the whole time. But they also generally would go faster because the tire is able to stay on the ground the whole time, and the person isn't having to absorb all of this energy of the bike coming up and going back down and up and down. Instead, the only thing that's going up and down, the sprung weight, is now much lower percentage of the entire weight of the bike and rider. The sprung weight is now just the front the front wheel and the lower part of the fork that moves up and down on the fork stanchions. And in the rear, it's just the rear wheel and the rear chainstay, the swing arm as we call it, moving up and down. And so that's a much smaller amount of mass that goes up and down than the whole bike and rider. So less energy is lost with the same amount of gravitational forces working on the bike and rider, but the bike and rider go faster because there's less energy loss and bouncing the whole thing up and down. And when you then think of, okay, well, what about a fat bike? People that are familiar with fat bikes, you can ride a fat bike with like 5-inch tires and no suspension. You can go pretty fast on one of those with really, really low tire pressure, like 4 psi or 2 psi on a rough surface. And because the sprung weight is now only the amount of tire that moves up and down until the size of the bump exceeds, probably half the width of the tire, then it'll lift the whole bike and rider, and so it's not going to be as fast on a really rough course as a fully suspended bike. But you can get the sense of how just this little amount of rubber and casing material is moving up and down, and the rest of the bike and rider is just going in a straight line. And so then on a road bike, that is also happening. It's just on a much more microscopic scale where you have the tire absorbing the little imperfections in the road or not. And then when you go to the opposite extreme and you think of like you're riding on polished marble or glass, then the fastest thing is going to be have your tire pumped up really, really hard. Then what you're trying to do is minimize the length of the contact patch so that there's less deflection of the tire, and then you have less energy loss than if you have a softer tire, and then every bit of tire that rolls past has to squish down considerably more in order to make that contact patch bigger, like I said, because the number of pounds per square inch is lower.
That's why track riders still would run really high pressures, because effectively the surface of a track, most good tracks, is very smooth. Yep. Not that marble smooth, but close to it.
Yep, that's right. Yep. And that's why they use smaller tires too, smaller, little tiny 19 millimeter tires or something like that. Also because they don't require this bigger contact patch in order for cornering, because on a track, the banking of the track does the cornering for you. You're essentially riding in a straight line. You don't have to deal with that.
Getting into the practical side of this, let's talk a little bit about what this means in terms of rolling resistance, for instance. Speed, comfort, these types of things. How does pressure affect those attributes?
Well, I think everybody has a sense that the lower the pressure you have, the more comfortable the ride will be. And where you wouldn't notice a difference is similar like what we just talked about. If you're riding on polished marble or glass, there would be really no difference because you're not getting bounced around even at really, really high pressure. Your comfort is related to how much you're getting bounced up and down. And, this whole thing where, when I was a little kid and you'd see runners, the fastest runners in the world in the Olympics in the 100-meter dash, they were just wearing little short, loose shorts. And now they're all wearing like really tight, long lycra shorts. And the idea is to minimize the vibration of their muscles and that they're more efficient the less their muscles are getting bounced around. That same thing applies on the bike. And so comfort is, I think that's a pretty good gauge of that. It's pretty directly related to efficiency of the bike moving down the road or trail.
Chris sat down and asked Shimano's road brand manager, Nick Legan, his perspective on tire pressure.
First thing I want to ask you, since you have so much history as a mechanic, working for the best in the world at the Pro Tour level, for some really big teams racing in Europe who probably have some bias towards what they should do with tire pressure, all the way to today. That's almost probably 2 decades of evolution in how people think about tire pressure. How have you seen the thought process change around that, very particular subject?
It's absolutely changed. And I would argue that, in fact, my World Tour experience was kind of prior to some of this more recent learning on CRR, rolling resistance, and really data-driven decisions. I think Josh Portner, with Silka, has done a lot of research in this realm. Tom Onholt has done quite a bit of rolling resistance testing at home, and I've followed that with fascination. When I was a pro mechanic, we ran pretty high pressures. We ran tubulars all the time. We now know that in a lot of instances, a clincher tire or a tubeless tire can be faster. We now know that wider tires can be beneficial.
Right.
I'm not going to say always. And we also know that tire pressure, the brain can misconstrue sensations that we feel when riding a bike as fast.
Right.
And that's not necessarily the case. Essentially, the way I look at it is, if you feel your tire doing something, it's probably not at the right pressure. And when it disappears, you're probably getting closer to optimal.
When it's more supple and it's absorbing a lot of that surface, whatever that surface might be.
Absolutely.
Rough gravel, pavement
Road.
that isn't as smooth as you really think it is. That
Mountain
sort of
biking,
thing.
even.
Mountain biking.
It doesn't matter the same could be said for your car tire or motorcycle tire. You name it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have followed this evolution and this recent uptick in research and thought put into tire pressure.
Absolutely.
What then do you recommend to people as they try to think about this, as they're learning themselves what to do with tire pressure?
Well, the first recommendation I would make is don't buy a thing. Don't spend another $1
Right.
until you spend some time actually approaching this scientifically. You can do what we call bracketing, where you try it at the highest end, at the lowest end, and then you find the middle. You bracket down in on what's probably an optimal or at least a better pressure for you.
It's
and
kind of like, sorry to interject, but it's not unlike when you're taking, back in the days when you used film in a camera, you would bracket the exposure. You'd maybe go a little over, you'd maybe go a little under, and then somewhere in there you'd hit the right exposure.
That's exactly it. And that's where I learned the terminology.
Yeah.
That's how old school I am.
Yep.
In terms of, developing film in a dark
Exactly.
room. Similarly, though, with your tires, I think the other thing to have a good understanding of is what are you bracketing towards? What's the end goal? And if you're just looking, let's say, for better control of your bicycle, if you're racing criteriums, for instance, cornering prowess might trump the best actual rolling resistance number for it.
Right.
If you're looking at gravel, maybe it's a comfort thing, or mountain biking, it can be more comfort driven. So none of those things are superior to another. If you're doing a time trial, it's probably rolling resistance is what you're really seeking.
Pure speed.
Absolutely. So have an understanding of what your goal is, and then go about figuring it out. And then once you start doing some of that bracketing, you might realize that the product you have on your bicycle might not be best for you. So it might mean a wheel change, because maybe you want a wider rim. Maybe you want to go tubeless where you had inner tubes before. There are a lot of decisions then that kind of follow from that.
It's kind of amazing how complex this can get. And a lot of people don't think at all about tires.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where, I'll repeat it. Don't buy anything. Use the things you already have to get better, to find something that's better for you.
Make informed decisions is what you're getting at.
But
and
also
that's Nick in
understand-
a nutshell, isn't it?
I hope so. Let me think on that for a second. But I think more than anything, I think it's really easy to underestimate the effect that tire pressure has on your cycling experience.
Yes.
It's massive. And again, you don't have to spend a dime. In fact, you might have to do less work by running a lower tire pressure than you do to pump that thing up rock hard.
Yeah. I'd hate to call it a bias, but I know that you are one of those people that if you were in a group on a group ride and you went around and you used your thumb to give it the pressure check with your thumb like people do,
Yeah,
people would be like, "Man, Nick, you run your tires low."
I do. Absolutely.
Because
I'm a fan of big tires. I'm a fan of lower pressures for lots of reasons. One, I'm 155 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a heavy rider. I have, knock on wood, very few flats in a given year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not hard on equipment.
Yep.
So for me, I don't see why would I create more vibration into my system. You know, this is fast talk. You guys have talked about, I'm sure, the effects of vibration on musculature,
Right.
and how it creates fatigue.
Yep.
So I'm also not that gifted. So I gotta pull it out the stops, man. I'm gonna wax my chain. I'm gonna keep my pressure lower so I can just hang with the group.
Yeah.
You know.
Right.
So, but I run lower pressures. I mean, it's rare. At this point, it's rare that I ride a tire because I'm not road racing. To put that out into the world,
Yeah.
I'm not road racing anymore. I'm not criterium racing. I'm riding the road. I'm riding a lot of gravel. But a 32 mil tire is about the smallest tire I ride anymore.
Yeah.
And
is massive compared to what most people have in their.
I had 18 millimeter tires when I was a kid, and I was like, oh, I'm going so fast now.
Well,
And we thought that.
When we spoke with Leonard, there's this mindset you have to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Hard equals fast. When you, like you were saying earlier, if you feel your tire doing something, that's probably too
working.
high of pressure. Yeah. Whereas it used to be back in the 70s when Leonard was at the peak of his racing career, like if you felt every single vibration coming through that bike, you felt like you were flying.
Well, it's that high frequency.
Yeah.
And our brain associates that with speed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where our brain's trumping us up. But even when I was running, let's say 25s or 28s, I rarely saw 80 PSI as a very specific example. But these days I rarely see 50.
Yeah.
So
would you say there's as much art as there is science to this still?
There is to some extent, because I don't have a lab. You know, I'm not doing roller tests like Tom Onholt. I'm not sending things to is it Finland or whatever for the
wheel energy.
Wheel energy, exactly. So, and I think where the art comes in is a bit with, you know, it's one thing to talk about rim width, it's another to talk about tire width, but then you still have tire casing differences.
Yes.
So I was having a conversation last night with a sponsored athlete for Shimano, and that athlete, we were discussing some different tire options for gravel that athlete is considering for the next season. And he was experiencing some burping on this given tire with our rim. And I kind of pointed out was that particular tire, and I don't want to name names in this case, but it's a really, really supple tire.
Mm-hmm.
So for the same feel or the same probably rolling resistance, you can run that pressure a little higher on a really high-end supple casing tire versus something that's a little more kind of garden hosey, you know, something that's just a little more durable and a little less flexible, and probably has a longer wear, like a longer lifespan, but it's not as much of a performance tire. So to get the same kind of equivalent feel and handling characteristics, the tire pressures will be different.
Yeah. And I think that's where some people get tripped up, is that you have to consider all of these factors when you're making the optimal choice. It's not just about pressure anymore. It's about casing, it's about width, it's about rim width, it's about surface, it's about all of these things, and trying to bring all of that information together to make the right choice. But
I would also say it is complex, especially when you start talking to Leonard about all the math and the numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, he goes all Los Alamos on it, you know?
He does.
He's incredible. But he's also really good at boiling it down and saying, don't let that stop you from experimenting, though. Life gives us this opportunity. Most of us ride well, I hope we all ride 5+ times a week. But each one of those is an opportunity to try something. So there's no reason not to experiment.
Now back to Leonard.
So there's one other definition that we haven't spoken about. It's another cool one. It's another physics lesson. Hoop stress.
Hoop stress has to do with the relationship between the size of the air chamber and the force on the walls of it, the stress on the walls of it. So actually a good example is those inflatable tennis courts, those tennis courts that have a big dome over them.
Yeah, like the bubble place where you would go inside and play tennis in the winter.
Exactly. And those things,
or a soccer field or a track, they look like the Michelin Man blown up on.
Yeah, and they're blown up, but you go in there and you don't have the sense, your ears don't start popping like crazy and everything. You don't have the sense that it's a lot higher air pressure in there in order to keep this thing inflated. But you do know that if you were to blow up a much smaller thing, a balloon, for instance, that it's going to take a lot more pressure. That would be something that you would, if you were to somehow be able to climb into that balloon, your ears would pop like crazy because you would be aware that it's a lot higher pressure in there. But the bigger the surface is, the amount that it inflates is related to the stress on each square inch of it. When you have a huge surface, the stress is much higher for any given pressure change, the bigger it is. And another way to think of it is a vacuum chamber. If you were to suck the air out of a small thing, there used to be a museum in the town I grew up in where they would create little vacuum chamber out of aluminum foil. And when
you grew up in a strange town.
Yes, I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico.
There were
Science museum,
vacuum chambers laying around on the streets.
Exactly. So if you suck the air out of to go to like literally a zero vacuum on a small thing, let's say the size of a cigar tube. A cigar tube, you could probably suck all the air out of that cigar tube if it's an aluminum cigar tube, and it's not going to collapse. If you have something the size of a house and you suck all the air out of it, the walls of this house are going to have to be super, super, super thick to not collapse in because of this hoop stress thing, where the amount of force, the stress on each individual square inch of it is related to its diameter. It's proportional to its diameter. If you're thinking of a cylindrical or spherical thing, when we're talking about tires, if you have a tire that's a 19 millimeter tire, say, and you pump it up to 150 pounds per square inch, it's going to feel quite hard. If you have one that's twice as big, so 38 millimeter tire, if you pump that up to 150 psi, it's now got double the diameter and the hoop stress is double. So the amount of stress on each fiber in there is twice as high. You know that 150 psi on a 19 millimeter tire, that's starting to push the limits of it. Well, if you put 150 psi on a 38 millimeter tire,
don't do this.
Don't
people.
do it. The hoop stress is so high, even though the construction can be exactly the same material, same construction type, same thickness, everything. That tire will fail, or if it's a clincher, it'll fold the walls of the rim out and just blow it right off of the rim. So if the 19 millimeter tire you're running at 150 psi, then with a 38 millimeter tire, you'd need to run that at 75 psi. That would be exactly the same hoop stress. So the tire is just as hard.
Rock hard
at 75. And there's no reason to go any higher. If you want the tire rock hard and your 19 millimeter tire was rock hard at 150, well, it's going to be rock hard, the 38 millimeter at 75. And then, if you go, what's twice 38 is 76 millimeter tire, which is 3 inch. Is that 3 inches?
It's like a 29 plus tire.
29 plus tire. So that would have to be half again, which would be 37 psi would be rock hard for
yes,
that tire.
yes. That's why you can get away with, I mean, not get away with, but that's why in a fat bike, when you're running a 5-inch tire, 4 psi is it sounds like, oh my God, that's nothing, but it's plenty.
Yeah.
And the stress on the hoop stress is actually something inside that tire. 4 is a small number, but the hoop stress is plenty. It's not going to roll off the rim. You're going to have a good amount of suspension and traction and all of that. So it's this proportional amount of stress for the given width of a tire, and those two are related.
Yep.
Yeah, I was shocked the first time I got on a fat tire bike. The guy at the shop was debating, should we pump you up to 3 psi or 4 psi? And all I'm thinking is
difference.
And all I'm thinking is, I think my pump at home starts at like 10 psi.
Yeah, that is the problem with fat bikes. You need a different pump or a different gauge. So
related to width, you have to adjust the pressure based on the width first, like we discussed earlier when talking about hoop stress. The bigger the tire, the lower you have to run the pressure in order to just maintain the same hardness of the tire. If you're riding a criterium, I'm aware that when I was serious about racing in the early 80s, that the pros, like in the Tour de France, Greg LeMond, I remember him crashing in the critical time trial, like final time trial of the Tour de France, when he was trying to take down Bernard Hinault and succeeded in doing that. He crashed in that time trial. He was running 19 millimeter tires at ridiculously high pressure, but this is a European course with sharp corners going through little towns and stuff like that. And we all thought a harder tire, that smaller, harder tire, that's going to be the fastest thing. It's definitely the lightest thing to have a smaller tire because rubber is dense, it's heavy. It's definitely not the fastest, and it should be clear to anybody that it's not the most traction on a sharp corner. And I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have had that crash in that little town making this sharp turn at that high speed if he'd had, say 23 or 25 millimeter tire. And
who would, nobody in their right mind would run a 25 back then.
Yeah.
They were racing cyclocross on 25s back then.
That's right. When I first was racing, when I raced cyclocross nationals in 1980, I had 28 millimeter tires.
That's hilarious.
We all had. And it should be clear that if you're riding a criterium, a bigger tire is going to give you more traction on the turns. And criterium is very based on the cornering. And if you can take the corners faster, you have to do less accelerating afterward. You're going to expend less energy. And so that's the first thing.
So body weight.
And then body weight, the heavier you are, the higher the pressure you need, because what we're talking about is, say we want a certain total amount of surface area on the ground of the tread patch. And so the bigger you are, the more the tire squishes out when you sit on the bike with the same amount of pressure in the tires. The heavier you are, the higher the pressure you need. Conversely, the lighter you are, the lower the pressure you run. And so if you're, say, a 150-pound rider doing a criterium on a pretty smooth road, well, I'd say a 25 millimeter tire. Now we're talking about, if we talk about hoop stress, so if this person, say, would normally ride 23 millimeter tire at 90 psi, well, now a 25 millimeter tire is, what percentage bigger is that? That's 2 out of 25 is 8% bigger, right? So right away you have to go 8% lower, so the 90 psi now becomes 82 psi to just have the same amount of hoop stress, the same hardness of the tire. And so right away there, if you're going to 23 millimeter tire, a pretty smooth road, I'd say that would actually be a pretty good setup for a guy at 150 pounds, is like 80 psi, and again, it's the amount of weight that's on each wheel. Most people put the same amount of pressure in both tires, but the fact is you don't have the same amount of weight on each end. At best, you have probably 60-40 distribution of weight front and rear. So you really ought to adjust the pressure accordingly and have, say, 82 in the rear and 78 in the front, something like that.
Right.
And then you get even performance from both tires.
This is another reason why people should race cyclocross, because we all know that. Like, we all run different pressures in the front and rear tire. Not to say that other people don't get that, but it's just a familiarity thing and a just second nature that you run a little bit higher in the front in cyclocross than you do
A
in the
little bit
rear.
higher in the rear.
Sorry, yes. Well, why don't we jump to what you've seen in the laboratory, for instance, at this Wheel Energy Lab in Finland? Could you take us there and explain the lab, explain what they do there, explain sort of the science behind what they're trying to prove over there?
The lab, it's called Wheel Energy Oy. Oy is like incorporated in Finnish. They are measuring rolling resistance of tires by measuring the amount of power it takes to drive a big drum. So you could imagine that the bigger this wheel with a tire on it is rolling on a drum, and obviously the bigger the diameter of this drum, the more it's going to represent what riding on a flat road is like. If you got a small drum, then it's just going to be deflecting really deeply into the tire. It's not going to be nearly as representative of what you would see on a flat surface. So
that's more like riding on a set of rollers in your living room.
Yes. Yeah, and if you've done that, you're sort of aware, like if you run that at really low pressure, of how much resistance there is, because it's pushing so deeply into the tire, and then that hysteresis curve we're talking about of that rubber then returning to its original shape after being so deeply deflected is just a huge energy loss. So they have a giant drum, and the drum, you can think of it either as have the drum be free to turn and you're driving the wheel, or the way they do it is the wheel is free to turn, but the drum is being driven. Mm-hmm. And then you set the parameters. We're going to test this at 30 miles an hour, say. So you turn the drum at the speed that the wheel would be rolling down the road at 30 miles an hour, and you measure how much power it takes to drive it. And then you vary the pressure or vary the tire or whatever it is you're looking at. Vary the diameter of the tire or the diameter of the wheel, the width of the tire.
A lot of variables.
The tread compound, whatever it is you're looking at. And then you try and compare apples to apples. Like you try just, if you're doing tire pressure, you keep the same tire, wheel, everything, and you just keep varying the pressure and measuring how that changes. So that's the first thing about it. But the drum is it's a big aluminum surface, so it's smooth, and that's not that representative of what you would have on the road. So then they have different surfaces that they can then apply to this drum to represent different kinds of road surfaces. And so the one that we tended to commonly use when we were doing testing with them was diamond plate, which is, you've seen it on metal stairs. It's those metal stairs that have those little diamond shaped raised up sections going at different angles to each other. And so that's fairly representative of certainly of a chip sealed road. It's definitely not as much like a gravel road or something, but it's rougher than a really nice road. Certainly rougher than a track. That really the only thing that's representative of a good track is probably the smooth roller. But then anyway, they have all sorts of different surfaces that they can then wrap around this drum. They also can use it to measure grip, so they can see as the thing is turning, they can tip the wheel at an angle and then try and push it and see how much force it takes to make it slip.
Where it releases,
and then you can change again whatever you want, the tread compound, or if the surface is wet or dry, or tire pressure or whatever, and see how it affects that. They also do things where they have a piece that's representative of the same type of material. This wheel that's rolling on the drum is then weighted with whatever the parameter is. You're going to say, okay, so 150-pound rider is going to have 60 pounds on the front wheel. So then maybe pushing down with 60 pounds or something like that. And then you could also do the same thing with this clear surface, and then you push down with the same amount, and then you take a photo from underneath, and you can then actually have a picture of this contact patch. You can measure the area of it. You can do a lot of things with it, and then especially if you're thinking about this grip deal where you then tip it on edge, and you see what that contact patch looks like on edge, and then see, okay, we know that this thing slips when the contact patch gets smaller than this amount, and then
smears into a smaller and smaller shape until it releases.
Yeah,
Yeah, you can find that release point. So last year, you and I, Leonard, we got the crazy idea to do some testing specific to gravel riding. Since gravel riding is so hot right now, everybody's into it. It's one of those arenas where you've got some people coming over from cyclocross or mountain biking who maybe get tire pressure, and the fact that lower pressure is actually going to make a huge difference on gravel bikes. And then you've got some roadies coming over, and they're probably like, nah, I still have to have 80 psi in my 35 mil tires or 35C tires because pressure. But we had this crazy idea of not only going into the lab at Microbac and testing on their apparatus, but also going out onto a piece of gravel road and doing some rundown tests. I don't know how many laps I did. We recruited my dad. We recruited some other people. We dealt with wind. We dealt with a lot of other conditions and variables that we were trying to control for. But ultimately, we learned some things. So maybe you could describe that test, and the payoff at the end of the explanation is we get a sort of a practical answer about what do I do about running, what tire pressure do I run on my gravel bike? And then we'll get into other bikes and other surfaces.
Okay, so the one you mentioned was in the lab at Microbac. In the lab at Microbac, we tried to represent some sort of situation like you'd encounter riding on a gravel road. And in that case, it was the rider was riding on rollers, and a couple of the rollers had big bars welded on them, and
ridge, or we called it the bump test, didn't we? It was just like
Yeah.
this thick knob on the roller itself. So it was an unpleasant ride.
Yeah. Then you'd have the rider ride at a certain speed, so in a given gear at a given cadence on smooth rollers, and measure how they have power meter on the bike measuring how much power it took them to do that. And then you'd put different rollers with different thicknesses of this ridge, lengthwise ridge down the rollers, and the rider's getting bounced around. You can tell it's taking more energy because you can hear the noise of the person bouncing around and everything, but then measure how much more power it takes for that person to ride the bike at that same cadence and in the same gear, and then try different pressures, and that was one way to do it. Although while you can measure it very accurately, the question is always, well, what exactly does that represent? This small diameter roller with a big ridge on it that it hits every time that comes around. What kind of a road are we simulating? And
or like train tracks, I think. If you were riding down to across a trestle bridge, perhaps if you're doing La Ruta, you're familiar with this. And I have done that, but otherwise, it's not.
You don't know what you're simulating. So how useful is that in the real world? So then we tried to do one that was real world, but rolling resistance is generally a much smaller effect on the rider than is wind resistance. So you want to separate those two. So we were doing it roll down tests so that just you have only the effect of gravity on it. You have the same hill you're rolling down, same every time, and you're going from the same point to the same point. But if you just were to measure the speed, measure how much time it took to get from point A to point B, you may not be measuring the rolling resistance of the tire, because you'll have you'll have the wind changes in the wind, just all maybe even changes in
Positional
temperature.
changes, temperature changes, all of that stuff.
Yeah, you have too many variables. So in this case, what we did was we had two riders who start close to each other, but not so close that one of them is drafting the other. We had an electric eye that catches them when they start, and then that catches the spacing between them when they start, and then catches the spacing between them at the finish, and see what the time, if one rider is catching up on the other rider or is getting further away, and by how much, and then we know on that particular road surface, which is representative of that one gravel road.
Sure.
Then this is gonna be the tires that were. So we were in that particular case. We did ones where we had a whole bunch of different tires of the exact same construction but different diameters, and we looked first of all at
different widths.
At different widths, different widths. Tire diameter, wheel diameter is still the same on all the bikes were the same. What one was faster, and these are small differences in time, so it was important to use an electric eye rather than a hand timer because there would have been too much error.
So let's talk some scenarios. So let's just go with kind of a default starting point. We have a 70 kilogram rider running 23.
70 kilos.
So
I'm 79.
158 pounds.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
So 158 pounds, road race, typical paved surface, running either 23 or 25C tires. For both of those, what sort of pressure would you be recommending to them?
On a pretty smooth road, you're gonna probably run 90 on the rear, 85 on the front with the 23 millimeter, and more like 80 on the rear, 75 on the front with the 25 millimeter. And then if the person is 200 pounds, then it becomes more like 100 on the rear and 95 on the front in the 23 millimeter, and 90 on the rear, 85 on the front with the 25 millimeter.
Wow. Okay.
Did you hear those gasps out there? I did.
Yeah.
Wait,
It
what?
is lower than most
What?
people think.
What?
Yep.
Yep.
It is.
So what about a crit?
But this is science.
And a crit, you have two things going on with a crit. On the one hand, lower pressure is going to increase the tire contact patch. You're going to get better cornering. So a bigger tire, lower pressure is going to be good. On the other hand, you get up out of the saddle and you sprint a lot in a crit. And then if you have a squishy tire, you're losing energy there. You're doing a balance. I think crit riders in general, I don't know if it's just because trackies use such high pressure and people equate crits with riding on the track or something, and
hard is fast, Leonard. Hard is
that's
fast.
right.
That's the mentality, I think.
And I think it is. And there is a feeling like you get on a bike with really hard tires and it feels, it's so bouncy. It feels like, wow, I just feel fast. You throw the bike back and forth and it's like immediate reaction. Well, it feels fast and feels bouncy because you're doing all the work. The ground's bouncing you along, and every little one of those little bounces is costing you energy that you put into the bike to get it going,
and fatiguing your muscles in some way over time.
Yeah, I can draw a parallel with brakes. It used to be that when we all had rim brakes that people would get these red brake pads are really, really hard, because they'd grab the.
Oh, they didn't like that squish.
Yeah, they'd pull the brakes, and it felt, wow, that's a hard brake. That's really good braking. Well, it feels that way because you're doing all the work. When a squishy pad means you've got this much greater mechanical advantage, and you're able to actually compress the pad. That means that there's quite a bit more force going into the rim, quite a bit more friction, and you actually want a squishy feel to the brake. Indicates higher power, not lower power, and so
better modulation.
Exactly. So it's a similar thing with the tires. in a crit with sharp turns, with a lot of sprinting out of the corner, you'd probably want a fairly hard tire for the exits from the turns and just go with a little bigger tire for better grip. So maybe run 25 and yeah, the 158-pound guy still probably run maybe 85 rear, 80 front, something like that. And then there's definitely going to be no deflection on that. It's a hard tire in that diameter when you're sprinting. But on the other hand, it's a pretty good size contact patch, and you'll be cornering definitely better than the guys on the 23 millimeter tires at 130 psi that you're going to be racing.
Right.
Who still killed me.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing to think about is that what we're talking about for small differences in pressure and similar tire construction and all that, we're talking about differences on the order of a watt or two per wheel. And when somebody can put out 50 more watts than you, if you're saving 4 watts, then he's still going to smoke you.
Yes.
The thing that I like to remember is, for a crit, that little bit of savings is something, but you could essentially negate it with some of these other factors. Just more powerful rider. You take that one corner the right way, and it's like erases any advantage you had from 2 watts from the. But in Dirty Kansas, when you're racing for 12 hours, and you're running 60 psi in your 40C tires, and that is just abusive to your body. You're wasting a ton of energy because of all of these physical factors we've described, whereas the guy running or the girl running 30 psi has a huge advantage, not only in terms of rolling resistance, but in terms of comfort, cornering grip, etc. You extrapolate that over 12 hours, it's massive.
Yep.
Where in a crit, personally, if it's a really technical crit, I'm willing to say I'll accept a few more watts in order to be able to get around the corners a little better and not have to worry about sliding out.
Right, exactly.
Time trial. And not a technical time trial. We're just talking about standard out and back. Maybe you got a couple turns. That's about it.
So on a time trial, you, of course, have to think about the aerodynamics first. That's the most important thing in a time trial. And clearly, the bigger the tire, the more aerodynamic drag there's going to be on it. So you also have to have a rim that is mated to that tire size. So, airplanes fly big. A big airplane, the bigger the airplane, the bigger the thicker the wing is. So it's clear that you can have pretty low drag of a wing with a big frontal area if you have the shape behind it be right. So you can get away with a pretty big tire aerodynamically if you have a rim that matches it. But if you don't, if you have this big step, you got a big tire sitting on a skinny rim, then there's going to be all this turbulence there, and that's going to maybe way more difference than the tire ever could. The first thing always in a time trial, think of aerodynamics, and then assuming that you have a tire that's matched to the rim, then a 25 millimeter tire, there is a little more weight, but in a time trial, it's once you get it up to speed, there actually is no difference. It's just the initial acceleration, and you, if it's a straight out, like out and back time trial, there's only 2 accelerations at the start and at the turnaround, and so otherwise it's just steady state riding, and then you're just talking about reducing the rolling resistance. So you're going to be better off on, most roads have more roughness than you would think. If it seems like it's a pretty smooth road, you're still probably going to be faster on a 25 millimeter tire with something like 75 psi in the rear and 70 in the front. You're not going to lose anything by it if the rim is mated to it, and if not, if you got to go 23 millimeter tire in order to have a rim that matches it better, then probably 80 psi in the rear, 75 in the front. And what I talked about earlier, comfort being a good judge of efficiency, that if you're rolling along and your elbows are not getting bounced around on the elbow pads because the tires rolling smoothly across the ground, that's saving you a bunch of energy, both in concentration and in your muscles being beaten up by getting bounced around. So if you're trying to be on a magic carpet, if you can be on, and just go smooth and have all the little ripples in the road just get absorbed in the tire and not get pushed up into your elbow pads.
Now, so we just talked about the 3 types of standard road racing. Does rain impact these?
That's a good question. To get the tire to stick to the road when you're cornering, you want to have as much of the tire on the road as you possibly can. And so it's really going to depend on how much rain there is. If the road is just a little bit wet, it's going to be better to have a bigger, broader surface to contact it. If it's a situation where you have a thick layer of water, like, where you're really shooting up a lot of water up onto your feet and everything, and you're basically pushing a wave along, then what you want to do is cut down through that. You want to skinny your tire at a higher pressure to get down to actually the ground and not be hydroplaning, not be floating up on it. And there's a similar argument if you're riding like cyclocross or mountain bike in the mud. Most of the time you'd probably be using really, really, really low pressure. Like cyclocross, you never talk about width because everybody uses 33 millimeter width for everything.
Right.
But in most mud conditions, you want to have, usually in cyclocross, you don't talk about tire width because everybody's using 33 millimeter width tires. You talk about tire tread and you talk about pressure. In mud, yes, you want a deep tread that digs into the mud and grabs the mud, but also releases it easily, has big spaces between it so that the mud can get back out. But in terms of pressure, if it's really greasy and slippery, you're going to be running really low pressure, like, a 150-pound guy might be like 14 psi. It's like ridiculous how low for a 33 millimeter tire, basically a road bike. But
they're going to run that pressure if they have lots of wheels.
If they got
if
lots
they have
of wheels,
one set of wheels, they might want to bump it up a little bit so they don't crack them.
That's true.
And
also it does depend that they have to have a tubular tire for that.
Sure,
if you
sure.
do that on a clincher, you'll just ruin the rims, the rim walls immediately. But you really run low pressure. But if you've got deep mud, you actually, the same way we're talking about hydroplaning, you really want to cut down, like you think of pounds per square inch. Well, you want to get some of those square inches actually into the ground. And so a tire that cuts down deeper into it is going to be better. That you're going to run higher pressure if it's really deep mud in order to get down and find something to bite into instead of spreading it out over this really mushy stuff on top. Mountain bikes, a lot of these arguments are the same with mountain bikes, that mountain bikers, just like they're using more and more suspension travel every year, they tend to get wider and wider tires, and also, the wheel diameter. It's fairly clear that people that are racing cross country, where they're trying to certainly minimize their rolling resistance, that a bigger diameter tire is going to roll over 29-inch wheel, doesn't fall into a 26-inch hole, that you're gonna roll over.
You're effectively smoothing out the ground by that larger diameter. Just in the same way the larger drum doesn't smash into your tire on the set of rollers, or the test that we were describing earlier. It's the reverse of that in a way.
Or if you've got a heavy wheelbarrow load and you have a really rough area that you're rolling it over, real rocky, if you have little tiny wheels on that wheelbarrow, it's going to be really hard to push it compared to one of those ones that has the huge wheels. So that's the first thing, is to think about the wheel diameter, and then tire width. I think people have been, when the first 29er tires came out, it was 29 by 2 inch. That's what everybody used. And now Then it went to 2.2 and 2.35 and 2.4, and now it's 29 plus, which is a 3-inch tire. And that may not be used for cross-country racing because of the weight and others. That's the major consideration. People are generally amazed that have been riding, say, 2.3-inch tires, and they get on the 3-inch, and they are amazed at how fast they go. In order to maintain a similar hoop stress, you're going to be running a lower pressure the bigger the tire you go to. That if you go from a 2-inch tire to a 3-inch tire, and say you were running that 2-inch tire, say at 30 psi, well, now you have to run it at the 3-inch tire at 20 psi to be at the same hoop stress.
I think that's an important point, honestly, about all of this, is the fact that you might have to experiment a little bit with this stuff to sort of overcome your bias and also just get comfortable at lower pressures. Particularly, not obviously, you're not, on a road bike, you're not going to run low pressure so that there's a different sensation. But effectively, or to be most effective in something like cyclocross or mountain biking and stuff like that, you will run pressures where at times your tire will squirm underneath you, and it's a different feeling. So to get the most out of your tires, performance-wise, comfort-wise, on rougher surfaces, it means running pressures where cornering is going to feel different.
Yeah,
take some getting used to. But the point being, just experiment with this stuff and overcome some of those, that's not possible to have your tires only pumped up to 75 psi in a 25C tire and still be fast. Like, it's true. It's going to be.
Well, there's a huge perceptual component that we all have. You think smaller is faster, and you think higher pressure is faster.
Hard is fast.
The science just doesn't line up with that, but you have to get across. It's one of these things where it's just perceptually, if you go with your gut instinct, it's that's what you think, and you have to kind of fight what your gut's telling you a little bit.
For decades, you probably did this. You probably ran those silk tubulars at 130 psi, and they were rock hard and they felt fast. But it took some time for you to overcome that, and some people are still fighting that urge to have their tires be rock hard because it has this sensation of being fast. But all we're saying is, drop it down a little bit, try it out.
That's right, and if you really do, like Chris said, have to get used to that squirm feel when you start pushing the limits of pressure, where you really are getting down low enough. For instance, in cyclocross or mountain biking, a lot of times you're riding on a side hill where you need traction on the side of something, and it should be pretty obvious to you that if you have that tire really pumped up hard, you're going to slide right off that side hill.
Right.
And if you have it really low, you're going to be able to, the tire will be able to conform to it, and you'll be able to ride across something where other people have to jump off and run, and that'll make a huge difference. Even if the rolling resistance were higher, the fact that you're riding and they're running, that's going to make a big difference. And it's a very weird feeling at first, for sure, to be, in my case, 175-pound person riding a 25 PSI in a 33 millimeter tire. It feels squirmy when you come into a corner hard, and and when you're on pavement, it feels ridiculous. You're like, there's no way this will work. It's just like, you feel like you're trying to turn a tractor. It's like, what is this hard feeling of, because you have so much tire contact patch that you're just forcing this tire contact patch to twist on the road.
Right.
And it feels horrible. But
if you were a kid, you'd say you were riding on flat tires. Right?
Exactly.
But you're not. So we've already talked about gravel a couple times. We mentioned the testing that we did, Leonard. We talked about Dirty Kanza and how much you save over such long races, and a lot of gravel races, not just Dirty Kanza. A lot of gravel races are really long events, so you're extrapolating these savings out over a huge length of time. But what's the takeaway there for gravel racers?
Yeah, I would say the best takeaway is run a lot lower pressure than you think you ought to. And you mentioned Dirty Kanza. I mean, I think one thing about Dirty Kanza is that there's these really sharp pieces of flint Flint Hills of Kansas, and they're sharp. And you can imagine how much harder the tire hits that if the tire is pumped up hard than if it's soft. People get a lot of flat tires in dirty Kansas. They cut a lot of tires. And if you can avoid that, you're going to be faster too. The fewer tires you have to change, the faster your time's going to be. Just impacting those sharp flint things more softly is going to behoove you in terms of the durability of the tire as well.
Well, Leonard, we want to put you on the spot. We want to, this is years and years of tinkering and thinking and researching this subject, but what are the main take-homes that people should take from this episode about Zinn and the art of tire pressure?
If you hop on your bike and it feels really bouncy and fast, your tires are probably too hard. That if you get on the bike and the bike feels squishy and comfortable, that's probably where you want to be. Just like with your brakes. If brakes feel squishy, they're probably better brakes.
This runs counter to a lot of things that most people have in their minds. Yeah, but science bears it out. Trevor, do you have any thoughts here?
I'm not sure I have anything to add. I'm actually remembering back a long time ago when I was a Cat 5 and being really excited because I had won a Cat 5 race and then checked my tire pressure because, of course, when you're a Cat 5, you check your tire pressure after the race.
Of course.
And I was at 85 PSI and I was bragging to all my friends, can you believe that? I won the race and I was only at 85. And now with what we know, that probably helped me.
Yes, it probably did.
Mm-hmm.
So really all I have to add is there's many years and just this perceptual thing that makes us think thinner's better, higher pressure's better. And it's just not the case. Get over the perception, get over that years of gut that you have developed. And listen to what the science is saying.
I guess my final thoughts would have to do with fully appreciating the beautiful tire. I think it's a neglected, misunderstood part of riding bikes. There's a lot to be gained there. Sometimes we're talking about sort of small changes in the watt savings, but it really is a lot more than that. We're talking about this sort of fine mixture of grip versus comfort, rolling resistance versus vibration, energy savings versus traction. All of these factors go into it. We didn't even talk about compounds that much. We talked a little bit about the width of rims and how they made up with a specific tire when it comes to time trialing, but honestly, rims just continue to grow, and it's changing how people ride, and it's changing what tires they want to ride because they can maximize the benefits that we're getting out of new constructions or new materials and this sort of thing. So my take home is really to fully appreciate the often neglected tire.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at fasttalk@fastlabs.com or call and leave a voicemail at 719-800-2112. Subscribe to Fast Talk on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play, or wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcasts. Be sure to leave us a rating and a review. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is @RealFastLabs. For Leonard Zinn, Nick Legan, and Trevor Connor, I'm Chris Case. Thanks for listening.